I can't wait for the field trip today.
Have a great day at school, sweetheart.
Good morning, Mr. Johnson.
The morning began like hundreds of mornings before it. At exactly 6:18 a.m., Daniel Harper parked his yellow school bus outside Maple Ridge Elementary, just as he had done for nearly 17 years. The engine hummed quietly beneath him, while a cold October wind carried fallen leaves across the empty parking lot. One by one, children climbed aboard with oversized backpacks, unfinished breakfasts, and stories they couldn't wait to tell. Daniel greeted every child by name. Some parents joked that he remembered birthdays better than teachers did. Others trusted him with the most precious part of their lives every single morning, without giving it a second thought. Around town, he wasn't simply known as the bus driver. He was the man who never missed a route, never raised his voice, and never drove away until every child had safely reached the front door. No one standing at those bus stops could have imagined that before sunset, every television station in the state would broadcast Daniel Harper's photograph beneath a chilling headline. They would no longer call him a hero. They would call him the prime suspect in a murder investigation. And somewhere inside a crowded courtroom months later, a prosecutor would stand before 12 strangers and argue that the same man who had risked his own life to save 27 children had secretly taken another person's life only hours afterward. What nobody realized that quiet autumn morning was that the most dangerous part of Daniel Harper's day had nothing to do with the school bus. It began after the last child stepped safely onto the sidewalk, when one ordinary decision placed him at the center of a crime he never saw coming. The truth, however, was already waiting, hidden inside a place investigators wouldn't think to examine until it was almost too late. And by then, an innocent man's life would already be falling apart. Daniel Harper had driven the same afternoon route for nearly 2 decades, and routine had taught him that the quiet moments were often the most comforting. By 3:47 p.m., the last child had climbed down the bus steps, turned back with a cheerful wave, and disappeared through the front gate of a small white house on Willow Creek Road. Daniel smiled, checked the mirrors one final time, and slowly pulled away. To him, it was simply another ordinary workday coming to an end. His mind had already drifted toward home, where his wife, Emily, would probably have dinner waiting, and their daughter would almost certainly tease him for forgetting to buy the ice cream he had promised the night before. But life has a strange way of changing direction without warning. Only 12 minutes later, traffic along Riverside Industrial Boulevard came to a complete standstill. Flashing police lights reflected across the windshield of the empty school bus as officers hurried between patrol cars with urgent expressions. Curious drivers stepped onto the sidewalk, whispering among themselves, each trying to discover what had happened inside the abandoned warehouse district. Daniel remained inside the bus for several moments before a uniformed officer motioned him to stop. "Sir, would you mind stepping off the vehicle for just a minute?" The question sounded polite, almost routine. Daniel never imagined that those few words would quietly divide his life into 2 chapters, everything before this afternoon, and everything after it. The officer asked whether Daniel had driven through the industrial area within the last hour. Daniel answered honestly. Yes, he had. Riverside Boulevard was the fastest route back to the transportation depot. He explained that he had noticed nothing unusual except an unfamiliar black pickup truck parked beside Warehouse 7. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He hadn't even thought about it afterward. The officer thanked him politely and wrote something inside a small notebook. Daniel climbed back into the driver's seat, believing the conversation was over. It wasn't. By the time he returned the bus to the depot, detectives were already reviewing nearby surveillance cameras. One grainy image showed a yellow school bus passing the warehouse less than 3 minutes before local businessman Richard Dawson was found dead inside the building. The footage was too blurry to identify faces. It revealed no crime, no weapon, no struggle, but it did reveal one thing. Daniel Harper had been there. And sometimes, when investigators are under pressure to solve a high-profile murder, being nearby can become almost as dangerous as being guilty. That evening, every local television station interrupted regular programming with breaking news. Reporters described the victim as a respected community investor. Helicopter footage circled above the warehouse while anchors repeated the same sentence again and again. Police are searching for everyone who was in the area shortly before the shooting. Daniel watched quietly from his living room. He felt sympathy for the victim's family. He felt grateful that he had been able to answer the officers' questions. Never once did he imagine that, somewhere inside police headquarters, A detective had already written his name across the top of a growing investigation file. Outside, rain began falling against the kitchen window. Inside, Emily noticed something her husband didn't. Daniel hadn't touched his dinner. Not because he was afraid, because somewhere deep inside, a feeling he couldn't explain had quietly settled into his heart. The kind of feeling people often remember later, when they say they should have known something was terribly wrong. The knock came before sunrise. At exactly 5:41 a.m., while most of Maple Ridge still slept beneath a blanket of autumn fog, 3 unmarked police vehicles rolled quietly onto Daniel Harper's driveway. Their headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the small front porch where pumpkins Emily had decorated only days earlier now cast long, uneasy shadows across the wooden floorboards. Inside the house, the coffee maker had just begun to brew when another sharp knock echoed through the silence. Daniel glanced toward the clock, exchanged a puzzled look with his wife, and walked calmly to the front door, never imagining that the ordinary life he had built over 17 years was about to disappear before breakfast. Standing outside were 2 homicide detectives and a uniformed officer. Their expressions carried none of yesterday's politeness. Detective Laura Bennett stepped forward first, holding a folded warrant in one hand while keeping her voice steady and professional. She explained that investigators needed to search the property in connection with the Riverside warehouse homicide. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't demand a lawyer. He simply stepped aside and invited them in. A man with nothing to hide rarely imagines that the truth alone may not be enough. For nearly 2 hours the house became strangely unfamiliar. Officers photographed every room, collected Daniel's clothing from the previous afternoon, examined his work boots, searched the family garage, and carefully boxed away his mobile phone and laptop. Emily stood silently beside the dining table, gripping a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. Their teenage daughter, Sophie, watched from the staircase, frightened by the sight of strangers placing evidence markers beside ordinary family belongings. It no longer felt like their home. It felt like a crime scene. Then everything changed with a single sentence. One forensic investigator emerged from the garage carrying a small transparent evidence bag. Inside lay a dark gray work glove, worn and stained with grease from years of repairing engines and maintaining the school bus. The investigator quietly handed it to Detective Bennett. "We found gunshot residue." The words landed like a hammer. Daniel stared at the glove in complete disbelief. He recognized it immediately. It was one of the heavy-duty gloves he occasionally used while checking the bus engine before winter routes. He had never owned a firearm. He had never fired one. He couldn't understand how residue connected to a shooting could possibly be there. He looked toward Detective Bennett, hoping someone would explain the mistake. Instead, she asked him to turn around. As cold steel handcuffs closed around his wrists, Daniel heard something he would never forget for the rest of his life. Outside, parents had already begun gathering across the street. Someone had called the local news station. Camera lenses were pointed directly at the front door. Neighbors who had smiled and waved at him for years now watched in complete silence as officers escorted him down the front steps. No one shouted. No one accused him. Sometimes, silence hurts far more than words. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, tears filling her eyes but refusing to fall. She wanted to run toward her husband. She wanted to tell everyone they had arrested the wrong man. Yet fear had stolen every word from her voice. Sophie buried her face against her mother's shoulder, unable to understand how the same father who had tucked her into bed only hours earlier was now leaving their home surrounded by detectives. As Daniel was placed inside the back of the police vehicle, he caught one final glimpse of the yellow school bus parked beside the garage. The morning sunlight had just begun reflecting across its windows. Only yesterday, children had climbed aboard laughing. Today, the man trusted to bring them safely home was being driven away in handcuffs before the entire town. And somewhere inside police headquarters, investigators believed they had finally found their killer. They had no idea. They had just arrested the wrong man. The arrest changed everything overnight. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Daniel Harper's photograph dominated every major television broadcast across Ohio. News anchors repeated the same image over and over again. A quiet school bus driver in handcuffs, escorted between detectives beneath flashing police lights. The headline spread faster than the facts ever could. School bus driver charged in warehouse murder. Within hours, parents flooded social media with fear and outrage. Some demanded answers. Others demanded punishment before the trial had even begun. Rumors quickly replaced evidence. One anonymous post claimed Daniel had always seemed too quiet. Another insisted they had always had a bad feeling about him. People who had trusted him with their children only 24 hours earlier were suddenly convinced they had been living beside a dangerous killer. That is how public opinion often works. It rarely waits for the truth. It only waits for a story that feels believable. Inside Cedar County Jail, Daniel sat alone in a narrow interview room, staring silently at the steel table in front of him. The orange prison uniform felt unfamiliar against his skin, but nothing felt stranger than the accusation itself. Every few minutes he replayed the previous afternoon inside his mind, desperately searching for something he might have missed. Had someone followed him? Had he unknowingly driven past the wrong place at the wrong time? Had he spoken to someone he couldn't remember? The answer was always the same. Nothing made sense. Hours later, Attorney Sarah Whitaker entered the room carrying a thick investigation folder beneath her arm. Unlike many defense lawyers who begin with difficult questions, Sarah simply sat down across from Daniel and quietly said, "Mr. Harper, before we discuss evidence, I want you to answer only one question. Did you kill Richard Dawson?" Daniel didn't hesitate. His answer came immediately. "No." Not louder than necessary. Not dramatic. Just honest. Sarah studied his face for several long seconds before opening the investigation file. Years of defending wrongful conviction cases had taught her something that no textbook ever could. Guilty people often prepared their answers. Innocent people searched for explanations. Daniel wasn't trying to convince her. He was trying to understand what had happened. And that difference mattered. She slowly spread several crime scene photographs across the table. Surveillance still images. Forensic reports. Laboratory summaries. GPS records from the school bus. Cell phone location data. Everything appeared convincing. Too convincing. Then Sarah noticed something strange. One forensic report stated that gunshot residue had been discovered on Daniel's work glove. Another report confirmed that investigators had never recovered the murder weapon. A third document noted that Daniel's fingerprints were nowhere inside the warehouse. No fingerprints. No DNA. No eyewitness placing him at the scene. No financial motive. No history of violence. Nothing except one contaminated work glove, and a bus that happened to drive past an industrial building minutes before a murder. Sarah leaned back quietly. Something didn't fit. The evidence looked complete. Yet somehow, it felt incomplete. She closed the folder and looked directly at Daniel. "Someone wants this case solved quickly. That worries me." Daniel frowned. "Why?" Sarah answered softly. "Because when investigators become desperate to prove one theory, they often stop looking for another." For the first time since his arrest, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in nearly 48 hours. Hope. Not because anyone had proved his innocence, but because at least one person inside the justice system still believed that the truth deserved more than assumptions. Outside the jail, the investigation continued moving in only one direction. Toward conviction. Detectives believed they already had enough evidence to win at trial. They had absolutely no idea that sitting quietly inside the police evidence archive was a forgotten security server no one had examined. A server that had automatically recorded something no human witness had seen. And when someone finally pressed play, everything the prosecution believed would begin falling apart. For the next 3 weeks, the investigation continued with remarkable confidence. Detectives believed they had assembled a case that would survive any courtroom challenge. Television commentators described the evidence as overwhelming. Newspaper editorials praised investigators for solving the murder so quickly. To the public, the story already seemed finished. The only thing left was the trial. Yet Sarah Whitaker had spent enough years defending innocent people to recognize a dangerous pattern. Whenever an investigation appears too perfect, it usually means someone stopped asking difficult questions. Every evening after leaving the county jail, Sarah drove back to her office carrying another box of police reports. The lights in neighboring law firms would gradually disappear one by one, until only her office remained illuminated against the dark downtown skyline. Coffee cups accumulated beside stacks of forensic files. Surveillance photographs covered the conference table. Maps, timestamps, witness statements, laboratory reports, and GPS records slowly transformed one quiet office into something resembling an active command center. She wasn't searching for dramatic evidence. She was searching for one inconsistency. Because wrongful conviction cases rarely collapse because of one enormous mistake. They collapse because of one tiny detail that everyone else ignored. Late one rainy Thursday evening, that detail finally appeared. Hidden inside a routine maintenance report was a single sentence that almost every investigator had skipped without noticing. Warehouse 7 internal security server temporarily offline. Backup storage transferred automatically to municipal traffic archive. Sarah stopped reading. Then she read the sentence again. Something didn't make sense. The detectives had repeatedly stated that the warehouse security cameras had failed during the murder. That explanation appeared throughout the investigation file. But this maintenance report suggested the recordings had not disappeared at all. They had simply been redirected to another government storage system that nobody had bothered to examine. The following morning, Sarah drove directly to the Cedar County Transportation Records Center. The building looked ordinary from the outside: gray concrete walls, fluorescent lights, narrow hallways lined with decades of archived municipal data. Most people would never imagine that thousands of forgotten digital files rested quietly inside its climate-controlled servers. A records supervisor greeted Sarah politely before disappearing into the archive room. Several long minutes passed. Finally, he returned carrying a small encrypted hard drive. "I don't know whether this helps your case," he admitted, placing it carefully on the desk. "Most of these backup files are automatically stored and almost never requested." Sarah thanked him, signed the evidence release form, and hurried back to her office. She connected the drive to her laptop. Hundreds of traffic recordings appeared on the screen. Delivery trucks, garbage collection vehicles, empty intersections, rain, fog, hours of completely ordinary footage. She almost believed the trip had been pointless. Then, one file caught her attention. October 14th, Riverside Industrial District, Camera 12B. Timestamp: 4:01 and 37 seconds p.m. Exactly 1 minute before Richard Dawson's body was discovered. Sarah pressed play. The footage was grainy, silent, far from perfect. For several seconds, nothing happened except passing traffic. Daniel's yellow school bus entered the frame exactly as investigators had described. It continued along Riverside Boulevard without stopping. Sarah paused the video. Everything matched the prosecution's timeline. She almost closed the file. Then she noticed something moving near the far edge of the screen. Barely visible, a black pickup truck slowly reversed out from behind Warehouse 7. The driver kept his headlights off. The truck turned onto Mercer Street and disappeared. Sarah leaned closer to the monitor. Her heartbeat quickened. She replayed the footage. Again and again. The pickup entered the roadway 43 seconds after Daniel's bus had already left the area. If Daniel had committed the murder, who was driving away from the warehouse immediately afterward? For the first time since accepting the case, Sarah wasn't simply questioning the prosecution's theory. She had just discovered evidence suggesting someone else had been present at the exact moment investigators insisted Daniel Harper was alone. She immediately reached for her phone. "Laura," she said quietly when Detective Bennett answered. "I think you've arrested the wrong man." Silence filled the line. Detective Bennett didn't respond immediately, because somewhere deep inside, she had begun asking herself the very same question. Sarah Whitaker didn't sleep that night. The surveillance footage had shattered the prosecution's timeline, but years of courtroom experience had taught her a painful lesson. One inconsistency rarely frees an innocent person. To overturn a murder case, she needed something stronger, something that didn't merely create doubt, but forced the entire investigation to collapse under its own weight. As dawn broke over Cedar County, Sarah spread every piece of evidence across her office once again. The forgotten traffic recording played silently on one monitor while police reports filled another. She stared at the timestamps, comparing every movement minute by minute. The more she looked, the more one question refused to leave her mind. If someone drove away from Warehouse 7 after Daniel's bus had already passed, who were they? The answer, she suspected, wasn't hidden inside another police file. It was hidden inside the victim's final moments. She immediately filed an emergency motion requesting complete access to Richard Dawson's digital devices. The prosecution resisted at first, arguing that investigators had already examined everything relevant. But after the newly discovered surveillance footage surfaced, the judge reluctantly approved her request. Late that afternoon, 2 sealed evidence boxes arrived from the police property unit. Inside the first box lay Richard Dawson's wallet, wristwatch, and apartment keys. Inside the second, his mobile phone. The screen was badly cracked, one corner blackened from the impact when it struck the warehouse floor. Detectives had extracted the call history weeks earlier and concluded the device contained nothing significant. To them, it was simply another processed exhibit. Sarah wasn't interested in the call history. She was interested in everything investigators had ignored. She connected the damaged phone to a forensic recovery workstation. Thousands of files slowly appeared across the screen: messages, photographs, deleted documents, application data, temporary cache files. Most were ordinary. Family pictures, business contracts, restaurant receipts. Nothing connected to murder. Hours passed. The office grew quiet. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Then, a tiny icon appeared in a folder labeled Temporary Media Cache. It wasn't listed in the official evidence inventory. It wasn't mentioned anywhere in the police reports. A partially corrupted video file. Length: 8 seconds. Sarah clicked it open. The first 3 seconds were almost useless. The phone pointed toward the warehouse floor, while footsteps echoed through the empty building. Heavy breathing filled the recording. Then the camera shifted. For only an instant, a man's face entered the frame. Not Daniel Harper. Someone else, wearing a dark construction jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The image blurred as Richard stumbled backward. A loud argument filled the speakers. Then one sentence emerged with chilling clarity. "You were never supposed to keep those files." A single gunshot exploded through the recording. The phone crashed onto the concrete. The screen went black. Sarah froze. She replayed the clip. Again and again. The face remained difficult to identify. But one detail stood out immediately. The man's right forearm carried a distinctive tattoo, a compass surrounded by broken chains. Sarah leaned back slowly. She had reviewed every arrest photograph in the prosecution's evidence package. Daniel Harper had no tattoos. Not on his hands. Not on his arms. Not anywhere. Which meant the prosecution's central theory had just suffered another devastating blow. Someone else had stood inside Warehouse 7. Someone else had spoken to Richard Dawson seconds before his death. Someone else had pulled the trigger. Sarah immediately copied the recovered file onto an encrypted drive before contacting Detective Laura Bennett. When the detective watched the recording, she remained completely silent until the final frame disappeared. Then she whispered something Sarah never expected to hear. "We never recovered this file." Sarah looked up, because nobody ever searched for it. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Everything they believed about the case had changed. Somewhere beyond the evidence room, a killer who had spent weeks believing the investigation was over had no idea that 8 forgotten seconds were about to destroy the perfect crime. The tattoo became the first real lead investigators had uncovered since Daniel Harper's arrest. Until that moment, every piece of evidence had pointed in only one direction. Now, for the first time, the investigation was beginning to move backward, forcing everyone inside Cedar County Police Headquarters to confront an uncomfortable possibility. They had not simply overlooked a clue. They may have built an entire murder case around the wrong man. Detective Laura Bennett returned to the evidence division before sunrise, carrying nothing except the recovered phone recording and a growing sense of unease. The bustling confidence that had filled the homicide unit only days earlier had quietly disappeared. Officers who once spoke openly about securing a conviction now whispered behind closed office doors. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but everyone could feel it. Something had gone terribly wrong. Laura replayed the 8-second video frame by frame until the blurred image of the unknown man's forearm filled her computer screen. The tattoo wasn't perfectly visible, but its outline remained unmistakable, a weathered compass surrounded by broken chains, inked along the inside of the right forearm. It was unusual enough to be memorable, yet common enough that identifying its owner would not be simple. She contacted the State Criminal Intelligence Database, requesting a search through thousands of previous arrest photographs. Hours passed with no results. Then another detective suggested something almost embarrassingly obvious. Don't search the tattoo. Search the victim. Richard Dawson had owned several construction companies over the past 15 years. Hundreds of contractors, subcontractors, warehouse employees, and temporary laborers had worked under his supervision. If the man in the recording had known Richard personally, his name might already exist somewhere inside old employment records rather than police files. Boxes of archived personnel documents were delivered from a storage warehouse before noon. Most contained nothing useful. Expired contracts, payroll summaries, insurance forms, background checks, page after page of ordinary paperwork. Then Detective Bennett stopped turning pages. One employment application included a photocopy of a driver's license. The applicant folded his arms while standing in front of the camera. Part of a tattoo became visible beneath the sleeve. Laura immediately compared it with the recovered video. The design wasn't identical, because the driver's license photograph had been taken 12 years earlier. But the compass, the broken chain, the placement on the forearm, it was the same tattoo. The employee's name was Victor Hale, a former site supervisor who had been dismissed from Dawson Construction 6 years earlier after allegations of financial fraud. According to company records, Victor had repeatedly accused Richard Dawson of withholding evidence that could have cleared his name during an internal corruption investigation. Lawsuits followed. Public arguments filled local newspapers. Friends described the two men as enemies who had not spoken in years. Yet one detail immediately caught Sarah Whitaker's attention. Victor Hale had never been interviewed. Not once. His name appeared nowhere in the official investigation file. No detective had requested his alibi. No one had searched his vehicle. No one had questioned where he had been on the afternoon Richard Dawson died. Because investigators had already convinced themselves they had found their killer before they ever reached his name. Laura closed the employment file slowly. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't looking at new evidence anymore. She was looking at everything the investigation had failed to investigate. Within an hour, officers arrived at Victor Hale's last known address. The house stood empty. Mail overflowed from the front porch. Neighbors explained they hadn't seen him for nearly 3 weeks. One elderly woman quietly mentioned something detectives had never heard before. The morning after that murder, he loaded a black pickup truck, and he never came back. Laura stood frozen beside the driveway. A black pickup truck. The same vehicle seen leaving Warehouse 7. The same vehicle investigators had dismissed because they believed it had nothing to do with Daniel Harper. Now every overlooked detail was beginning to connect. Every ignored witness. Every forgotten report. Every missing interview. Every assumption. For weeks, the investigation had been built like a straight line leading toward Daniel Harper. But the truth had never followed a straight line. It had simply waited for someone willing to look in another direction. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, Victor Hale still believed he had escaped unnoticed. He had no idea that the investigation he thought was over had just begun. The homicide unit had spent nearly a month building its case against Daniel Harper. Every report, every press conference, every courtroom filing had pointed toward one conclusion: that a respected school bus driver had committed murder. Yet as Detective Laura Bennett walked into the State Forensic Laboratory, carrying a fresh stack of evidence requests, she could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth that had been growing inside her for days. If the investigation had overlooked one suspect, how many other mistakes had it overlooked? Dr. Michael Evans, the laboratory's senior forensic scientist, welcomed Laura into a small examination room lined with stainless steel benches and sealed evidence cabinets. He had testified in more than 200 criminal trials during his career and had built a reputation for treating science with far more respect than public opinion. Before Laura even explained why she had returned, he noticed the expression on her face. "You don't believe your own evidence anymore," he said quietly. Laura didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed Daniel Harper's gray work glove on the examination table. "I need you to test it again." Dr. Evans frowned. "It was already processed." "I know. I need you to process it as though you've never seen it before." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dr. Evans nodded. "If we're doing this again, we start from the beginning." Over the next 48 hours, every step of the original forensic examination was repeated. The glove was photographed again, sealed again, and tested again under strict contamination control procedures. Unlike the first examination, every technician worked independently without seeing the conclusions reached by previous investigators. Late on the second evening, Dr. Evans called Detective Bennett back to the laboratory. He didn't look excited. He looked disturbed. Without saying a word, he placed 2 laboratory reports side by side beneath the examination light. "The original report," he began calmly, "states that the particles found on Mr. Harper's glove are consistent with gunshot residue." Laura nodded. Dr. Evans slid a second report across the table. "Our independent examination reached a different conclusion." She lowered her eyes. The report identified microscopic particles of barium, iron, and industrial brake dust, materials commonly found inside heavy vehicle braking systems and diesel engine compartments. There was one element missing. Lead. The original forensic report had classified the particles as gunshot residue because of a contaminated comparison sample processed earlier that same afternoon in the laboratory. Someone had unknowingly compared Daniel's work glove against evidence from an entirely different firearm investigation. The mistake had transformed harmless mechanical residue into what appeared to be incriminating forensic evidence. Laura stared silently at the report. "So," she whispered, "there was never gunshot residue?" Dr. Evans slowly shook his head. "No, there never was. The laboratory reached the right conclusion, using the wrong sample." The room fell silent. Weeks of investigation. National headlines. A family torn apart. A respected man's reputation destroyed. All because of a single laboratory contamination that no one had questioned once the investigation settled on a suspect. Dr. Evans leaned forward. "Science didn't fail. We did. We stopped checking our own assumptions." Laura closed the report carefully, but her thoughts were already racing ahead. The surveillance footage. The recovered phone recording. Victor Hale's disappearance. Now the forensic evidence itself had collapsed. One by one, every pillar supporting the prosecution's case was breaking apart. Back inside Cedar County Jail, Daniel Harper remained completely unaware of what had happened. He sat alone inside his cell, reading the same paperback novel he had been unable to finish for weeks. Around him, the evening count echoed through the corridor as heavy steel doors slammed shut one after another. He had stopped asking when he might go home. He had stopped believing anyone still cared enough to search for the truth. Outside those prison walls, the truth was finally beginning to fight its way back. And this time, it wasn't arriving as hope. It was arriving as proof. The call came just after sunrise. Detective Laura Bennett had barely stepped into her office when her desk phone rang. The number flashing across the screen belonged to the Missouri State Highway Patrol. At first, she assumed it was another routine inquiry connected to the reopened investigation. Instead, the officer on the other end spoke with a calmness that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the room. "Detective Bennett, I believe we've found the man you're looking for." Laura froze. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. The officer explained that just before dawn, a state trooper had stopped a black pickup truck traveling east along Interstate 70 after noticing that one of its rear brake lights wasn't working. It should have been an ordinary traffic stop. The driver handed over his license without argument. But when the trooper entered the name into the national database, an investigative alert immediately appeared on the screen. Victor Hale, the same man whose name had surfaced only hours earlier inside Richard Dawson's employment records. Laura didn't waste another second. Within an hour, she and 2 homicide detectives were on a flight to Missouri, carrying nothing but a slim evidence folder and the 8-second phone recording that had rewritten the entire case. When they arrived, Victor Hale sat quietly inside a small interrogation room. He looked older than the photographs in the employment file. His beard had grown thicker. His hair was shorter. But one detail remained impossible to mistake. As he folded his arms across the table, the sleeve of his jacket slipped back. There it was. The compass tattoo, wrapped in broken chains, exactly where the recovered video had shown it. Laura placed a printed still image from the phone recording beside a recent photograph taken during Victor's arrest. She said nothing. She simply watched his eyes. For the first time since entering the room, Victor looked away. At first, he denied knowing Richard Dawson. Then he admitted they had worked together years earlier, but insisted they had not spoken in a long time. When Laura quietly placed the surveillance image of the black pickup truck onto the table, his confidence began to fade. His answers became shorter. His breathing slowed. The certainty that had carried him through weeks of freedom was beginning to disappear. Then Laura reached into the evidence folder one final time. She pressed play. The recovered phone recording echoed through the interrogation room. "You were never supposed to keep those files." Victor's face changed instantly. Not dramatically. Not like the movies. It was smaller than that. His jaw tightened. His eyes fixed on the speaker. For just a fraction of a second, he recognized his own voice. Experienced detectives often say that people can hide emotions from other people, but almost no one can hide recognition from themselves. Laura stopped the recording before the gunshot. Silence settled across the room. Victor stared at the tabletop. Neither detective spoke. They didn't need to. Minutes passed. The air inside the room felt impossibly heavy. Finally, Victor whispered something so quietly that Laura almost didn't hear it. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. No one interrupted him. He rubbed both hands across his face before speaking again. Richard Dawson had discovered financial records linking Victor to years of fraudulent construction contracts. According to Victor, Dawson had threatened to hand the documents over to federal investigators unless the missing money was returned. Victor agreed to meet him inside Warehouse 7, believing he could convince him to stay silent. But the conversation quickly turned into an argument. Richard refused to destroy the evidence. Victor reached for the folder. Richard tried to stop him. The gun discharged during the struggle. Panic replaced reason. Instead of calling for help, Victor gathered what documents he could find, fled through the warehouse's rear entrance, climbed into his black pickup truck, and disappeared before police arrived. As Laura listened, one painful realization settled over everyone in the room. Daniel Harper had never been part of Victor's plan. He wasn't framed because Victor knew him. He was accused because investigators found someone who seemed to fit the timeline before they finished searching for the truth. Sometimes, the most devastating wrongful convictions aren't built through corruption. They're built through assumptions, and assumptions can destroy innocent lives just as completely. The courthouse looked exactly the same marble steps, the same heavy wooden doors, the same courtroom where Daniel Harper had once stood wearing handcuffs while strangers whispered that they were looking at a murderer. Only this time, he walked through those doors as a man carrying something far heavier than chains. He carried 8 months of stolen life, 8 months without his family, 8 months of watching his daughter celebrate her birthday through reinforced prison glass, 8 months of hearing complete strangers describe him as a monster while knowing he had done nothing wrong. Daniel stopped for a moment outside courtroom 3. He ran his fingers across the edge of the wooden bench in the hallway, almost as if he needed to convince himself that this day was real. Emily quietly reached for his hand. Neither of them spoke. After everything they had survived, words no longer seemed important. Inside the courtroom, every seat was occupied. Reporters filled the back rows with cameras and notebooks ready. Parents from Maple Ridge Elementary sat shoulder to shoulder, many unable to meet Daniel's eyes. Some had signed petitions demanding that he never be released. Others had spoken against him on television before a single piece of evidence had been tested in court. Now, they had returned to witness something very different. Justice correcting its own mistake. When Judge Eleanor Brooks entered the courtroom, the usual conversations disappeared into silence. The prosecutor stood slowly. His voice sounded noticeably different from the confident tone Daniel remembered during the first hearing. Your Honor, after reviewing newly discovered evidence, additional forensic analysis, digital recordings, and the confession of Victor Hale, the state respectfully moves to dismiss every charge against Daniel Harper with immediate effect. No dramatic music filled the room. No applause echoed through the courtroom. Only silence. The kind of silence that follows the realization that an innocent man should never have been there in the first place. Judge Brooks removed her reading glasses and looked directly toward Daniel. Mr. Harper, this court recognizes that the justice system failed you. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You leave this courtroom today as a free man. The gavel struck once. Its sound echoed through the room for only a second. Yet for Daniel, it ended the longest 8 months of his life. Emily covered her face as tears finally broke through the strength she had carried every single day since his arrest. Sophie rushed forward before anyone else could move. She wrapped both arms around her father with such force that Daniel almost lost his balance. For a long moment, none of them let go. There are reunions that happen because people return home. And then there are reunions that happen because the truth finally catches up with a lie. Outside the courthouse, reporters immediately surrounded Daniel, microphones stretching toward him from every direction. One journalist asked the question everyone expected. Mr. Harper, after everything you've been through, do you hate the people who accused you? Daniel looked toward the old yellow school bus parked across the street. The transportation department had quietly brought it there that morning. Clean, polished, waiting. He smiled sadly before answering. If I spend the rest of my life hating them, then they take more than 8 months from me. They take everything. A few days later, Maple Ridge Elementary reopened its school bus routes after the autumn break. Parents stood silently along the sidewalks as the familiar yellow bus approached. When the doors opened, Daniel Harper stepped out wearing the same blue driver's jacket he had worn for years. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a little girl, no older than 8, smiled, ran forward, and hugged him around the waist. One by one, other children followed. Soon, the same community that had watched him leave in handcuffs now watched him return with quiet respect. Not because the headlines had changed, because the truth finally had. Months later, the state officially acknowledged the investigative failures that had led to Daniel's arrest. New forensic review procedures were introduced. Digital evidence protocols were rewritten. Investigators across the state received additional training designed to prevent future wrongful convictions. Those reforms couldn't erase what Daniel had lost. They couldn't return birthdays, family dinners, sleepless nights, or the reputation stolen from an innocent man. But perhaps they could save someone else. And sometimes, that is how justice finally begins. Not when a guilty person is convicted, but when an innocent person is no longer forgotten. As the yellow school bus disappeared down Maple Ridge Road beneath the golden colors of late autumn, Daniel glanced once more into the rearview mirror. 27 children laughed together behind him. The same children he had protected. The same children whose lives had unknowingly become part of the reason he almost lost his own. He smiled softly, placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel, and continued toward the next stop. Not because life had returned to normal. Because courage isn't measured by avoiding tragedy. It's measured by finding the strength to keep moving after surviving it. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving someone guilty. It's finally proving an innocent person was telling the truth all along. Fade to black.